Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi! In this episode, let's elevate intention for the year. How to prep and expect. To be ready to act, not react. To learn, not yearn in retrospect. So it's time to talk tech. Looking back to look forward. It's worthwhile to retrace, review, and remind ourselves how far we have come with waves, sometimes tsunamis, of new technologies emerging and surging into our worlds and work environments over a short period of time. Starting with piecing together early clunky hardware and applications for new chips, to the rudimentary beginnings of online commerce, and so many basic learnings and adaptations that we have iterated through already, all driving significant changes to business front and back-end operations, anticipating and evolving into new buying, living, and working dynamics and experiences. It is evident how fast we continue to evolve. So therefore, how can we best gear up, understand and accept new ideas and approaches, and engage with new tech and tools, able to recognize relevant impact and importance, and discern why, where, how, and what to implement effectively? I'm delighted to be speaking with Jeff Frick, a seasoned operator from the tech sector. Jeff is now the host of two podcasts, Work 20XX and Turn the Lens, as well as being a media entrepreneur, the founder and principal of Menlo Creek Media. Jeff is passionate about innovation at the intersection of technology and the future of work. Hi, Jeff. How are you?
I'm great, Sophie. Great to see you.
Good to see you too. It's been a while. Happy New Year.
I know. We've crossed over into 2024.
I start at the beginning. You studied economics with psychology. Why?
So I went to Claremont, a small school down in Southern California, and pretty much everyone there took econ or poli-sci as a major. That was kind of what most people did. So I joined on the econ track, but I got involved in psychology as an elective and really fell in love with the professor. Dr. Harv Wickman was his name, and he was a pilot. So he was very much into human factors and, in a pilot, when you need to get someone's attention, do you have a horn? Do you have a buzz? Is it a knob? Is it a switch? Is it a dial? Does it have color? So really starting to think about the human factors of the way we get information in and out. And then we had Rat Lab, which was really impactful. In fact, I ended up being an TA for Rat Lab because the first assignment was study your rat. Just sit with your rat and learn your rat's behavior with really not much instruction. So you sit there with a piece of paper and your rat.
And rats are really smart.
And then, what am I supposed to count? It's try to count his heartbeats. Do I count how frequently he sticks his nose in a corner? Do I count? It's just this really kind of enlightening.
You're sitting there with a rat?
Yeah. And when they first come, they're kind of wild. They mellow out a little bit as they get handled. But it was really an interesting way to get introduced into it. And so it was a lot of kind of social psychology and experiments in terms of how we learn, how we observe, what do we see. And then to learn just feedback, and the fact that, a random frequency and random payout is the most addictive way that you can get the rat to bang the bar. And they'll bang the bar till they run out of food and run out of water and fall over. So it's basically what a slot machine is. It's a random payout at a random rate. But because that next one might be it, and that next one might be big, that turns out to be the most addictive kind of pattern to get people to keep yanking on that one-armed bandit.
That's depressing. I think.
It is. It's so, because it's so predictable, right? It's just this whole dopamine thing. And that's what we're seeing in social media. That's part of their problem, because you don't know if that next notification is going to be
Is
either
going to
something
be-
really important, positive or negative, right? So kind of the random rate and then the random kind of
random
value
payoff, huh?
is really an addicting pattern for people and rats.
I want to go back to your pilot. I'm thinking about a cockpit, the knobs and buttons and switches and dials. And I hadn't thought about it before, that all those different elements are specifically designed in different ways to be easily differentiated from each other, the combination and the layout specifically from a psychological point of view.
Yeah, well, first off, there's the which is the best way to do the function, right? A dial or a knob or a switch. And then within like the lights and the indicators and the displays, how do you see or feel without looking? And then if it's like an emergency situation, so you say you have lots of information that needs to be communicated quickly, say audibly,
right?
Is it a flashing red light? Is it a tone? Is it a ring? Well, what if you have 6 different things that make noise? How do you differentiate the noises, and how do you make it easy for the pilot to quickly distinguish what's the important noise that takes priority over the one that doesn't? So it's just really thinking through the interaction between the machine and the person, how they input information and pull information out, right? So it's a very different world now. Most of the stuff I think is on displays. It's very kind of computer-centric, and they can get a lot more information into a single display. I'm sure there's software that throws up what's appropriate based on what the conditions are. But when it's all fixed, like it used to be, you're in a less fancy setup, those switches, dials, sit in a spot, and you got to learn through muscle memory and procedure.
The idea of all those dials that you have and how to differentiate between them, and therefore what is competing for our attention and where the priorities are. I'd never thought about that. So you did a double major in the end. What threads came out of both of those? Because it does seem that those two threads have very much been consistent through your career, how you've married them. First of all, after college, you went into sales, but then you were quickly involved in a whole bunch of different things. So I'm curious, as you were finishing your college degree and thinking about what you really enjoyed, what gelled for you?
I think it was especially juxtaposed to economics that people don't necessarily make decisions based on logic, right? They make decisions based on emotion, and emotion is a much stronger driver of decisions. So when I'd sit in economics, they'd have all these beautiful curves with all this beautiful math, and you're just like, it's beautiful
utility
math,
curve,
but
and you're like,
you start with these assumptions. How do you get these assumptions? And so I think that's probably what I took away the most. So then within my career always, in sales specifically, one of the things at our sales job is we weren't really trying to go sign new accounts. We were trying to grow the business within our existing accounts. So that means you have to learn what all the motivators are, from the person that receives the goods at the warehouse and the warehouse staff, through the bookkeeping staff who gets your orders through and gets your checks paid, through the salespeople on the floor, to the executives that you have to work for, and everybody in between. So how do you figure out what makes that person tick? And how do you align your objectives with what makes them tick? Because ultimately that's what they care about. Hey, how about that? How about that? I mean, it's a classic case. You'll love it. I mean, there's this one woman who kind of ran the access to the executive suite, and she loved, for some reason, one of those rubber band balls, like this giant rubber band ball that she put together. Well, guess what?
Okay.
I always asked her about the rubber band ball, and I always played with the rubber band ball anytime I was with her. And when I needed a favor, she helped me out pretty quickly because I spent the time actually asking her questions about the thing that she cared about.
That's why empathy really works with sales. All those people along the sales process, how they're feeling and what they're doing and what makes them tick. Absolutely. It's all about empathy. So I love hearing that. So from sales, you then added product management and other elements that started getting into the technical aspects. How did that happen?
So So things were going a little sideways in the consumer electronics business. I worked for Mitsubishi, and so it was before the DVD, and it was before HD, and the yen was getting upside down. So it was just a kind of a dark time. So I decided to go back to business school, and that's what I did. So I did sales for like 10 years. When I got out of business school, I wanted to come back to the Bay Area. I guess we'll have to get into tech. Who's going to hire a tech guy? What tech company is going to hire me with no tech experience? So I have to go to a big company, and I ended up at Intel. So that's how I kind of made the switch. And I thought, I'd already been in sales. I want to try something new. And so Intel hired way too many MBAs back in the day to kind of run all these programs. So what would happen? I worked on what was called the Merced chip. It was the first i64 64-bit architecture chip that Intel shipped. This is back in 97-ish. And so when they design a chip, there's like this whole ecosystem of parts that have to come together. So there's the chipset, there's the operating system, there's a workstation, there's a server, there's applications, and all this has to come together. So our job, each individual in the team would work with one segment of that ecosystem to basically make sure that the production was online, so that when the chip actually shipped, there'd be a chipset to stick it in, a computer to stick it in, an OS to run it, and apps to run on it. So that's how I made the switch and got involved. And I ended up working with the Japanese companies because I had worked at Mitsubishi before. So I worked with like Fujitsu and a bunch of these companies that were making these supercomputers on the new i64 chip. I didn't know anything. I walked in the first meeting. I did not understand a word that they were saying. And then I stopped at Barnes & Noble. I bought a tech acronym book. Well, every company has their own acronyms. That was worthless. And you can even have the same acronym in the sentence that means two different things in the same sentence. My favorite being ASP. What's the ASP of your ASP? Right. Which at that time was your average sales price for an application service provider, which is what they called them before they went with cloud. So that was kind of chaos.
That obviously somehow struck a chord because you stayed in tech for a very long time. What lit up for you once you actually managed to communicate?
So literally like an angel showed up on my computer one day because I did not like the microprocessor stuff. It was not pleasant. But literally on the internal intranet, which is what they called it back then, Intel announces a 50-50 joint venture with SAP, creating a company called Pendesic, which was the first or one of the very first shared services companies. See, the idea was we would create a B2C mall based on SAP R3 that we would rent space to these new things called internet merchants to sell stuff online, so they wouldn't have to build their own store. And we would take a percentage of the revenue. And so on January 1, 1998, I think, I did an internal transfer at Intel, got into that group, and it was this 50-50 spin out. So it was half Intel chip heads and half SAP enterprise salespeople. And none of them spoke retail.
Fascinating.
I was the only one that said, oh my goodness, can you imagine a buyer at Macy's trying to put in a sweater order for 16 colors in 6 sizes in what was then basically a German input screen on R3 for each of those SKUs? I mean, it was a great idea.
No.
Unfortunately, it wasn't necessarily the right tool for the job. And the internet was still probably a little bit slow. And the only merchants at that time were selling super cheap hardware components to tech geeks. So the gross margins were slim. So our taking a cut on it was rough. And so that did not end well. But that's how I got in. And I got into business development. And that was really early days of like APIs and integrating with like a shipping software company and a tax calculating software company. And all this stuff was brand new, payments processing company.
So you were seeing what the whole picture could look like,
Right.
and how it all didn't work for all kinds of economic and psychological reasons.
Right. And so like there was a demand. So that was part of our whole shtick, was that we would partner with best of breed application companies using this interesting thing called XML to trade information. And so we would say, okay, let's hear the top 3 shipping companies. Or the one that went crazy was auction. Auction suddenly got hot. There was like 4 auction companies. And then I think Salesforce bought one. Can't remember. There was, and then like boom, boom, boom. 3 of them got bought and 1 went out of business. And so, we got to meet all the auction companies and see their software. So it was a really interesting time. And then I left there and went to the business to business version of that called Acera, which was a big Kleiner Perkins, Vinod Khosla thing, arguably the Frankenstein of the internet bubble, maybe. Raised a ton of money. And then that was really trying to replicate the B2B, manage your supply chain using software. And then I2, and there were some other ones that were kind of on the supply chain. We were more kind of on the sell side distribution. So Cisco had a thing called Cisco Connection Online that they managed their distribution on. And so we were basically trying to recreate an enterprise software service version of that. And then 2000 hit and the whole thing cratered.
As the idea of online commerce, e-commerce is growing. I remember I was doing some fashion online in 1998, and the production line, the supply chain was not geared up for it. I mean, you could see that easily. If you were suddenly going to get all this business, what on earth were you going to do? How to manage supplies when you got all these new sales coming from all over the country or world?
Right. So the whole one of our big sales value propositions using R3 was real time. This is where I learned what real time really means, because real time is really, it should be in time to do something about it. It doesn't necessarily mean up to this microsecond status of everything. And I learned that the hard way. We had a customer, poor guy, sold basically any kind of branded thing, so TV show, movie, music, art, printed on anything. So, T-shirts, coffee mugs, pencils, whatever. So the combination of his SKUs, when you took all the different inputs versus all the different outputs, was basically infinite, close to infinite. Well, the problem is every time this guy's webpage loaded, the front page, it basically did a query of his inventory to update the catalog that was in the background for millions of SKUs. It destroyed his front page. His front page could not load. And that was really days of even Amazon, really starting to change people's behavior. I mean, it's hard to think of now when people would never put their credit card on the internet. Are you kidding me? And you had slower speed, connectivity. So it was a little bit of the Wild West. But then, 2000 hit and kind of the whole thing took a hiatus.
So then you started doing more consulting and leveraging all the different elements that you understood along the supply chain in terms of from sales to tech and product management and all those different things. What was the impetus to go outside of a technology company?
It's really a conversation with my mom, probably, because my mom always worries. All moms worried, and she was like, "Dad, Jeff, are you sure?" I'm like, "Mom, it's Intel. How can it go wrong?" And then she's like, the internet started. "Jeff, are you sure?" I'm like, "Mom, it's Intel and SAP, a joint venture. What could be stronger than that? Come on, that is a low risk startup." And that didn't go so well. And then I go to the next one with Kleiner Perkins. "Jeff, are you sure this is a good one?" I'm like, "Mom, it's Kleiner Perkins. It's Vinod Khosla. We have like $1 billion valuation, which in 1997 didn't happen very often. And then that didn't end up very well. So I just decided if the plane is going to crash into the mountain, I just assume be in the front than in the back. So, why not just get out front and, kind of invest on myself and try to figure some of these things out, because nothing is guaranteed.
And your mom was supportive?
She said, well, I think she's still worried. She's still a mom. But that was 20 years ago. So hopefully she's relaxed a little bit. Where I made my first foray into where I am now is I worked for a buddy of mine. He's got a company, was called Customware now. Then it was called Service Rocket now. And he was doing Atlassian stuff. I was doing Bugzilla So Bugzilla was the open source bug tracking software that most people started with when they started their company. And at some point they decided they didn't want to use it anymore. And so they would have to transition all those bugs into Jira. That was a big part of our business. And then we had training, and then they also had Confluence, which was the first kind of early kind of internet thing. But the things that struck me about it is this platform application view of the world, right? Because that's what they're very good at. But also they were early on in not using email. I mean, they only did it internally, but everything was a Jira ticket. So even though Jira tickets were designed originally to process bugs, it very quickly could be expanded into all different applications. So inside Atlassian, they don't use email. And that was the first time I had ever used that. Then they were the first ones really with the open source ethos, that share, and be so open. They came with this Australian attitude, which was kind of old school in terms of they were making money. They were already making money. So kind of like eBay, almost in that same time frame, if you recall, they almost had to take money just to be in the Silicon Valley Club. They were making money. eBay took money. Odomeyer took money to bring in Meg. And then Scott and Mike brought in Excel money, just I think to welcome to the United States. But they were profitable. And so just the way they run the company, a lot different meeting type of culture. They were really advanced for a lot of the stuff we're talking about today. They were doing in 2011 or 2010, which is when I was involved with them.
If you're communicating in a different way, you're working in a different way, you're already looking at the world in a very different way.
Well, and they also, before we leave Atlassian, they also were the first to kind of go after shadow IT, non-traditional selling methods, no golf course with the Oracle rep that we've had a long relationship that we're doing huge bucks. They had a promotional campaign, $10 for 10 Jira seats, and the $10 went to building schools in Africa. So who's not going to throw down to increase efficiency for my team $10? And so they totally, as AWS did, and a lot of shadow IT did later, come at it from the developer side for basically low cost, not coming down through an enterprise sale. And then when the developers go from place to place to place, they all use Jira. So they all just, you want to have Jira? Here's $10. I get Jira, and there's another school built in Africa. Genius, and so innovative and different than kind of the traditional, big time enterprise software plays, at that time, especially.
They have a history of not doing things the same way everybody else does. What then took you into media? Obviously, there's the technology thread there. And as the general manager, host, and executive producer of theCUBE, you were then the person who's actually drawing all this information and intelligence out. What took you to that opportunity?
So I was getting tired of Jira bugs. I had an out-of-body experience when we were looking at a project. So as you recall, Java, right, was open source before Oracle bought them. Sun owned them. Yep. And so they wanted to transition the God knows how many bugs there are in the history of Java from Bugzilla into Jira. And we're at this meeting, and it turns out that some of those bugs have full-on religious followings. They have special names and places in people's hearts because they're so long and epic that, some of these things are. And these people are arguing about like how far back we go with the bugs when we do the transfer. And I literally had an out-of-body experience. So I rose above the table. And this is at Montague offices, which used to be an insane asylum back in the day. Then it was Sun's headquarters. I literally lifted out of the table and said, I have to leave this. And again, a friend of a friend said, hey, a friend of mine's doing some cool things. You should check it out. And that's where I met John and first got exposed to theCUBE. And I went to one of their shows. It was so very early, very nascent. But I was like, this is a cool format. Most people never get the opportunity to tell their story in a professional setting. You're spoiled, I'm spoiled, we do it all the time, but most people never kind of get to sit down with nice lights when they're prepared and tell their story. And most people have an interesting story to tell if you're willing to kind of dig a little bit. And so that's when I got involved, and I said, I think there's something here. So tech was really the venue, but I much more like to get into the higher level stories of, why is this important, and why is it meaningful? And so we got in, and then we were able to kind of up the production value and up the shows, and it's just great. Got to really meet a ton of interesting people, have really great conversations, and really had a ball with it.
You're not allowed to skirt over that. It says that you did it for 8 years and interviewed 1,200 people a year. That's almost 10,000 people.
So I didn't interview all those. We interviewed about 10,000. I interviewed probably 2,000 of them.
So of the people who you interviewed and interviews that you might also have seen during that time, interviewing live is a particular type of situation and pressure and how you're drawing someone out. Who are some of the people who really stood out to you? There must have been a lot of very interesting learnings that you had during that period about people, about business, what works in a business. And some people who you said, I have no idea how they're successful. What on earth happened? What are some of the things that jumped out at you? Because there must have been some great moments.
Oh, so many. The one that jumps out immediately, and I'll say really authenticity is the key, right? It's these people when they really come through as their true self, and often that works well as a leader. So one that comes to mind right away is Fred Luddy. So Fred was one of the founders of ServiceNow. And he's made a ton of money, but he's just, he's not that tall, kind of he's like your uncle, and he says, he's like, I'm like a kindergartner. I want to see what I wrote on the fridge, on your fridge. And that's what motivates him. He's still a coder. Oh. He owns a room when he does a keynote like nobody else. They ended up taking him out of the CEO job to let other people kind of run the company when it got bigger and bigger. But he's so genuine. And when he would sit in his keynotes and talk about new buttons that he would put on and the process, you could tell he literally just loves to code and loves for people to use his code. Just so simple. Another one is Scott Cook from Intuit. That company was started from his wife's frustration, dealing with the checkbook. And as successful as they are, the great line I use from him all the time is, build your company based on low-cost experimentation. Let everybody experiment, see what works, see what doesn't work. And he still today, after all these years, is torn up about how hard finance is for small business. He still thinks they have so far to go, so much more improvement. So this kind of also just this relentless, never satisfied, always looking forward, never looking back, not really patting themselves on the back, but really falling in love with the problem and just passionately owning that problem.
And some of the extraordinary technologies that you're discussing, that's not going to go anywhere. And then it did. Were there certain ones that really came from left field and very surprising?
I think I'm probably more surprised by the stuff that doesn't work that's so hot for such a period of time, like Hadoop. If you remember the Hadoop big data thing, where it was an open source technology that was being used at Yahoo and being used at Google, but there was this trend that you could just throw everything into Hadoop and magically, you would extract value from your data. And it doesn't work that way. You need to have a hypothesis and test a hypothesis against a business case where you kind of know what's going to make the improvement. So what's interesting about technology, why I love being here and why I've been in it so long, is because it seems like we're always in the first inning. We never get to the third inning, and then suddenly there's something new that's big, that's new and big and comes along, whether that's on the microprocessor side, the operating system side, new software. I mean, the fact that, a browser turns out to be such an effective application delivery device, right, is crazy. I still remember when Netscape was new. So I still see the magic in all this stuff. Clearly we're at the edge of another giant wave now. And and it just keeps accelerating. That's the other thing. It just keeps going faster.
Jumping for a second to AI, with all this background in technology and all these new ideas that you have been hearing and interviewing people who are pioneering, talking about all these extraordinary things that they're creating. How does that compare to now and the extraordinary new developments that are happening with AI?
One thing I think is always important to keep in mind is kind of where it is today and where it's going to be in the not too distant future. And there's a lot of problems with where it is today in terms of accuracy. So just in terms of the performance, I'm actually the output to me still seems pretty generic. It doesn't seem that fantastical today. I think it's going to be fantastical in the not too distant future. And I think the other piece of the puzzle that's not talked about enough is a new way for you or I to interface with a supercomputer on demand without writing code. The fact that natural language processing and we can have an interactive conversation, and because it's cloud-based with a supercomputer that has God knows how many GPUs answering the query to your question, that is really pretty amazing. So I think it's going to get a lot better. There's been other versions of this. We talk about kind of things that came and you don't hear so much about. RPA was supposed to be our little bot people, helpers, not that long ago, robotic process automation. And then you find out, well, it's just kind of automating the matching of an invoice with a check. I think all these things will be much more significant in the not too distant future. And I think the not too distant future is collapsing a lot closer, faster than we think. And I also think that we misjudge time. To talk about, say, level 5 autonomy in vehicles. Okay, so say it takes 10 years. 10 years really isn't that long from now. And 10 years and then for a long time afterwards, it's those cycles seem short to me.
Moving from theCUBE to where you are now with a podcast focused on work 20XX, and Turn the Lens. You moved early in the pandemic. I imagine it was because you saw so much happening in the workspace related to technology. Is that how that evolution happened? And why the two different podcasts? What's the thread for each of those?
Sure. So that was partially, theCUBE's business was mainly events, live events. So when COVID hit, we had planned for May 2020, the biggest week that we would have ever had in theCUBE history in terms of I think it was 7 concurrent sets at 3 different shows in 3 different cities happening at the same time.
Oh my God.
So we were gearing up for that. And then COVID hit. And so obviously that ended. So I helped the company transition into virtual events, which we did. And then the thing that really started to hit me actually was from my playing on my electric vehicles and getting more into the YouTube world and really starting to understand better asynchronous consumption of media. And that because you have asynchronous consumption of media, it's you watch it on the time that's convenient for you in the format that you want to watch it, when you want to watch it, not when I decide, which is kind of goes against the event thing, except for the fact that, you're getting people together. And the other thing that asynchronous allows you to do is commingle your audience. And so the whole idea of a collaboration, I did a small stint for a while. This is a funny business now in hindsight. We were ripping people's CDs and creating MP3s. So this is before the very first MP3 player. So we'd get these huge collections from rich people and we would rip their CDs and create MP3s. Well, when we're doing the classification, we started to see collab. It actually hit music first, where you would have a guest singer. So we're trying to build the tables for, artist, album, track, title. Right. And then suddenly there's all these collabs. And so how do you classify the collabs? And there might be a couple of collabs. And so you started to see it there. And then when I started to get into the skateboard world and see how people were on each other's shows. And so you would introduce your community to the other community. And that really started to make me rethink how to get your message out, to really think about it from the consumer's point of view, make it available to them when they want to have it, make it, delivered it to them in the platform in which they are. And I decided I really wanted to explore that. And And then the other piece that you see in YouTube, right, is all these micro communities around any topic that you can possibly imagine. So this idea that with kind of a public distribution format, that can you, with your voice, whatever this topic is that you think is important, find your little slice of the 8 billion people in the world and build a community. And that's what I wanted to try. And that's really why I started to turn the lens to say, don't do what I say. Let me actually create a platform and do it. So to start doing interviews, start doing posts, start building the connections. And then also, congratulations to you, 100 podcasts and counting. There's no substitute for just doing. The only way you learn to do any of this stuff is just to do it.
I was going through the one with Drew Palos. I'd never heard of this Super 73 bike, EV bike, right?
Yeah.
That was really interesting to me. The interview you did with him about the thread of a community as being one of the core almost divisions of the company that was integral to the product, to the sales, but also there were all these add-ons to the bikes. And therefore, if something broke down, you actually needed somebody from the community, not for the company, but the community who was going to help build it. Fascinating to me. You're an EV bike geek, it seems, right?
Yeah.
So the combination of technology and community and enterprise seems to be something that has been a thread for you for a while. And based on what you're just saying about YouTube, how do you see this evolving as we're moving forward? Because community is even more integral to how we're living and doing business and working now.
I love how you love the community pickup, because I think a lot of people would say, what the heck is he interviewing Drew from Super 73? But he's also a nice guy, and it's a great company. So I love you picked up. I think it's one of your strongest competitive differentiators. I used to sell TVs, and a TV is a TV. So how do you differentiate it? And it's not features, it's emotion. Right? What is Ben and Jerry's all about? They're about the social. It's not about their milk is better or their sugar is better or their vanilla is better. It's about who they are and what they represent as a company. And I think, as more and more products are less distinguished based on just pure product attributes, if you will, I think it's community that becomes almost your most defensible competitive pillar. Because nobody else can be Ben and Jerry. You can make ice cream, but you can't be Ben and Jerry. And Super 73, it's an interesting story too, because that bike, it looks like it could be any bike. They pulled elements from a lot of people's childhood and melded them into one. Well, now there's probably 20 that if I showed you on flip cards without knowing it that closely, you probably wouldn't be able to distinguish them. Different brands who've kind of copied that. But, and to the point that, you don't just get community because you want it. You got to invest a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of hours. And that's really what I think was so special about Drew, is he's the one that's on the front line every weekend. And as you said, meeting people, asking questions, being interested, being a face of the franchise. Because that's the other thing I think, companies need faces of the franchise. That the community identifies as that company and kind of the spirit of that. And that's where, if you've got a great technical founder that can stay CEO, terrific. But those are, I think the face of the franchise, I think, is a pretty important concept.
And it was fascinating to me to be realizing that it's not just bikes, it's 2 and 4 wheels. But in order to drive the sales, it was creating the momentum of a movement. And there was a lot of energy that was driving for a much bigger thing.
Right.
In order to have the ripple effect of sales of the company, but really driving a much bigger effort.
And the fact that they would be open to not Super 73 e-bikes joining the ride, and people on skateboards, which is the 4 wheels or 1 wheels or whatever, and letting kind of the community trump the specific brand. It's bigger than the brand. It's part of a movement. It's part of an e-movement. It's part of having fewer cars. It's part of being more, ecologically friendly, taking up smaller footprints. It's also about having fun and and having that community. Drew's a good guy. I've done a lot of rides with him.
So to work and work 20XX, because there is a movement. One article, I think it was Dr. Gleb Tversky was saying the hybrid revolution, and then somebody else was coming at from a feminist revolution.
Right.
And whatever way you're getting there, whatever is driving for you as being the key reason that new ways of working, for me, we need to work like this. Technology is driving things in different ways. We don't have any choice. But whatever way you're coming at it, this is a new way forward, but there's a lot of energy coming at it from very different directions, which makes it fragmented and challenging. So why that podcast? And what are your themes? Where are you going with that?
Right. So it's kind of interesting. So when COVID hit, so like April 2020, no more shows. I'm running a media company. We need content. And so I started reaching out still at theCUBE just to talk to people who had experience with managing remote and distributed teams. Like Martin Mikos. I had him on. Martin now runs HackerOne. He was at MySQL back in the day, which was an early remote-only company. So if you recall, it was just like a desperation for people that had no experience in this, like how do we manage? So it kind of started from that. And that's also when I had Darren on. Because we had Darren on once before, and I knew Darren was the expert, and I was like, okay, Darren, just coach us up 101 for people that have no experience. So it was very kind of practical. So that's how I first got into it, was just really practically. How do we help people have better Zoom presence, blah, blah, blah. And then after I left, I had, a friend of mine at WebEx, they were putting together a thought leadership site around it, and they wanted a show. As part of that, there was a bunch of people that contributed writers. And so I got that opportunity to be the show. So they sponsored season 1. What's interesting is they had a specific objective to go after facilities people and corporate real estate people, which in my world at theCUBE, we never talked to those people. It was all enterprise tech, data storage, cloud, blah, blah, blah. But it was a really interesting experiment for me then to try to build an audience using the techniques that I had hypotheses about inside of LinkedIn in an area where I was literally starting from zero. So I didn't know anyone. Except I got Darren Murph to be my first guest, and I knew if I could get Darren, then that would, would give me the big star of approval, and that's actually what happened. And so we just started going down that path, and then as you know, the best part of this job is getting ready to do interviews, is doing the research. And so in doing the research of where Darren had spoken and kind of going back to this collaboration, that's how I was turned on to Ryan Anderson at Miller Knoll and his podcast, Looking Forward. And through that podcast is how I was introduced to Adrian Rowe. So, it just kind of webbed out from there. The WebEx sponsorship ended after season 1. So after 8 episodes, so we've continued, I think we're up to 80 or 23 or 24, not 100. So I'm not sure where it's going to go next. I think there's a couple different directions, and it depends if I get another sponsor. It can go more the people side, in terms of gig economy and fractional, and I think that kind of is the space I think I want to take it. But what I've always tried to do on a horizontal level is keep it just basic. It's communications, it's better meetings, it's it's the pragmatic steps that regardless of kind of your angle that you should take. It's flexibility, it's trust, it's team level agreements. And those things hold pat, I think regardless, but you get into things like health insurance and, some of these, I still think just the 1099 W-2, debate is really interesting. And also I think as more and more stuff gets pushed off to the gig economy, and, I have some not great feelings about that trend.
Going full circle back to your economics and your psychology, from all the interviews, where do you see that we are, and what are your expectations or predictions for this new year and beyond? I see technology driving extraordinary amounts of change in business, the highly digitalized way that we're working. And I don't separate business and work. The way we're working is because of how business is changing, and vice versa. For me, it's very much one and sort of part and parcel of the same thing.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of things that are kind of blended in happening together, so you can't necessarily see the impact of one. But there's the tightening of the labor supply, which is going to continue, right? But we still have layoffs. So are the layoffs just a rightening of companies that spent too much when money was free, or is it really a reflection of cutbacks? Earnings are coming in super high, so companies are making money. So, eventually are they going to start reinvesting in people, or is the computer going to take a lot of those jobs? I still think that's going to be a little bit slower than many people are predicting, and people always do find jobs. They don't,
Agreed.
right? They're not running looms anymore once the Luddites smashed everything up. So I think that's going to be a little bit slower. I think in the commercial real estate, I think there's a huge reckoning that's coming, but at the same time, we always know what happens in banking. It'll be kind of a washout recap and then a reset. And the interesting thing there from Phil Kirshner at McKinsey said that there's new sustainability laws with cash penalties in New York that might be the final death knell for certain types of buildings that don't make the cut. There's like a class of buildings that are not old enough to be cool and not new enough to be upgradable. And with that, it could be sustainability penalties that actually pushes that forward. I think
Interesting.
It'll be interesting when some big incumbents are taken out by some newbies that don't have the office expense on their income statement. And that's, I think, what's going to change and slowly start to change that. But we already see it when the banks will talk out of both sides of their mouth that as landlords, they're pissed about hybrid work, but as employers, they're cutting their own office back 30 or 40%. So I think that trend's going to continue, but those are a lot of big companies that will just recap after a BK, and I think it'll just be kind of it'll be a lot of paper read, unfortunately. But I think the trend will continue. I think people know what's possible, and it's just the people that are kind of lagging back to the time that, as Brian likes to say, kind of this fictional executive, what's his expression? Something that didn't really exist before. I mean, it didn't really exist before. I mean, Kate Lister, right? Teams have been distributed forever. I mean, even in 1987, I was a sales rep on the road. I mean, I had to stop at Denny's and call in my orders, but I wasn't in. I mean, if we were in the office, the boss is like, "Get out of here! Get out there with your customers."
Exactly.
So it's funny for the people that haven't been in office centric. It's not that big a change. And then the other thing is, you think of a classic office, right? It was literally the processing of paper from one inbox, do a process, stick it in the outbox, put it in the middle envelope, do the string, and that's not the way it happens anymore. I mean, the work isn't at the office anymore. It's in your phone, connected via cloud application.
From talking to Rob Sadow in December, and there's a number of companies who are storming ahead, the Atlassians of this world, and there are particularly financial banks in Wall Street that are stuck where they are, and they've just decided that that's where they need to be. And then there's everybody else in between who hasn't, for the most part, made a decision yet, or they're hybrid, they're fixed hybrid, not because they've made a commitment. Knowing the psychology of this, knowing how challenging that can be, the waiting and seeing, the watching what everybody else is doing, then is that going to help us make a decision? It's going to take time before we get enough long-term, irrefutable data, because it's not going to be conclusive. We only really have half of 22 and 23 as steady state to look at productivity or all these other measures that
right.
are very hard to track. So it goes back to the emotional aspect of it and the fear of the unknown. What do you anticipate happening this year because of where people's heads are, not where the businesses are?
Well, I do want to touch on the data, and I think there is more data than anyone is giving light. And yes, it's hard to measure productivity, but it's easy to measure profitability. It's easy to measure achievements against objectives. Rob's got data, where he cross-referenced against hiring, that people with more remote policies were hiring faster. So there is actual data that's not necessarily productivity. And as I mentioned, earnings are off the hook right now. So I think what COVID exposed more than anything was bad management, because I don't think the managers
Yes.
necessarily knew the objectives,
Yeah.
because I don't know that they necessarily got them from up high. And the other thing,
Right.
you just said steady state. That's never happening again. Today's the steadiest state we're ever going to have. Tomorrow's going to be less steady state. So I think waiting for steady state or thinking there's steady state is silly. I mean, I think it's much more like the old shark analogy, right? You're either moving forward or you're sinking, but you can't stay still. So I think I think the really big thing is the speed in which the demographic wave has significant impact on people's ability to get talent. And somebody called me out on LinkedIn and said, "What do you mean when you said talent? You always say talent." What I meant is like the best talent, to people that have options, because at the end of the day, it's the margin with the best people, not the people that don't have as many options, which a lot of people don't. That's going to make the difference in your competitive strategy. And to your point, if you're trying to optimize for steady state versus trying to build flexible and faster decision making, better decision making, a higher velocity of decisions, you're gonna lose. It's just a different world that I don't know that people understand how fast this thing is moving.
What is the most exciting technology that you see ahead, and the best advice that you have for bringing together all these different elements from everything that you've done, looking at technology and the transformation? I mean, you've been along at so many transformational moments, small and bigger ones, as technology has been integrated into our worlds. And now it's having all the more impact than it ever did. It's had a lot of impact along the way, but we haven't noticed it as much as this non-incremental step because of the pandemic. What would you say in terms of easing one's way forward as we move into start this new year?
I don't know if there's any easing. I will talk about what I'm excited about, though. So I will bring up drones, and I think it's exciting for two reasons. I went to a drone show in 2016 or 2017, and people weren't paying enough attention to drones because I think DJI, the main manufacturer, is Chinese, and there's questions with, are they snooping like Huawei, et cetera. But I went to a show and I saw commercial applications. For instance, factory inspection, electricity line inspection. We have a big issue here in California. We have big forest fires that are often caused by transmission line. So it can do all these crazy things. And then you add autonomy. So now you don't actually have to fly the drone. You tell the drone what you want it to do. So volumetric measure of a pile of coal at an energy generation plant, you can measure because you can tell the drone to fly the same every day, measure with a laser pointer. So think of it as a sensor that you can put anywhere. They're using them in construction sites to check percentage of completion because it can fly the same route every day and you can do a delta as to what changed. So when you add autonomy to a drone, and I wrote a post after that DJI show, and I said, look at what, this is before what's going on now, look at what having an Air Force did to warfare, because unfortunately war is often, a great creator of investment in technology, right? It completely changes everything in 1918 or World War I when suddenly they have airplanes. So now what if you as a business had your own Air Force? What could you do? And there's a lot of conversation about Amazon dropping off package, et cetera, et cetera. But that's just, that's nothing compared to, again, how many miles of transmission line needs to be inspected? How many nasty chemical and oil refinery, just nasty in terms of people and injury risk. And then that's just drones. So you can also have them on the water. You can also have them on the land. So when you start to add autonomy to these things, true autonomy, where you tell it what to do versus driving it, now suddenly everyone has that capability. What can you do with it? And I think it's a really, and of course now we're seeing it in the Ukraine war with Russia, and it's completely changed the battlefield dynamics, both in terms of asymmetric investment, in terms of what it costs to blow up something else, but also like they can't, you can't move people around a battlefield anymore. You just can't. There's eyes above all the time. So it's really huge change, and how if you can put a sensor anywhere, what would you put it and why, and how often, and what could you learn? So I think it's really, when you start to think about, when we get to level 5 autonomous cars, they won't have to be crash vehicles anymore. So what would you do with a car interior if you didn't have to build it for crash safety inspection? What's it look like?
Oh,
right.
Oh, wow.
And you say, okay, well,
I never thought
take
that.
forever. Maybe it takes 20 years for level 5 autonomy, but what if it's in a retirement community with a pretty defined geo-fence location, and the people that either can't drive, shouldn't drive, fall down a lot, or just need a ride to the grocery store, right? Hail the thing, get in and go.
And those are the communities for whom autonomous cars are such a quality of life changer. For me, that's the top level of who needs that kind of access to autonomous vehicles.
And too many people focus on kind of the most infinite edge cases versus, there's a lot of not edge cases in more controlled environments where you can do a lot of interesting stuff. Zoox is a company here locally that's got kind of this pod thing. It doesn't look like a car because it's designed for specific applications. So I think, that combination of robotics plus autonomy, plus, ridiculous supercomputing power, plus ridiculously fast connectivity. What would you build? Someone used to say, if compute and network and storage were free, what would you build? And basically, asymptotically, they're getting closer to that every day. So what would you build if everything was free?
Well, with that beautiful question and those positive ideas, thank you very much, Jeff, for sharing all your ideas. So much fascinating experience and that has evolved in all these different ways and bringing us to this moment with the insights that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, for having me on. Really a treat.
Thanks again so much to Jeff Frick, founder and principal of Menlo Creek Media and host of the Work 20XX and Turn the Lens podcasts. You can follow Jeff on LinkedIn and check out his podcasts at work20xx.com and turnthelenspodcast.com. Modern work comprises 4 core principles: learning, intention, flexibility, and empathy. Life. We are all seeking to learn and achieve a relevant, individual, and effective modern work-life equilibrium over time. Start this year being intentional, being proactive, so you are up to speed with where we are and continuing to prepare yourself for what's ahead. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You can also write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular updates, curated useful articles, commentary, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for listening. Until next time.